Hi everyone. As I'm sure you'll remember in great detail, last week Andrew gave us an overview of the timeline of the Bible and began our series looking at the life of Joseph. This week we'll be focusing on the failures God has chosen to reveal to us, that is, of Joseph and the other people that we read about in his life. So let's kick it off with looking at Joseph's father, Jacob. As we know, Jacob had a lot of sons, with Joseph being the youngest at this time. Now, any decent parent will say that they don't have favourites out of their children, and even if they do, they'll still treat them all equally. Not Jacob though. No, he did not even disguise his favouritism of Joseph, to the point of giving him an extravagant, expensive coat to parade in front of his brothers. Jacob did not consider how the rest of his sons would feel, how they would be affected by being loved less, but he also failed to remember that God created all humanity equal. He should never have treated one son as greater than the rest. So next we come to Joseph. Not only was he loved more than his brothers, and clearly treated better for it, he was also having dreams that showed his family bowing down to him. It is unfortunate that Joseph allowed himself to become arrogant, consistently telling his brothers about his dreams as if to lord it over them. Even his father rebuked him for it. The truth is, he didn't really need to keep telling his brothers about these dreams, and surely would have seen how they reacted to it. Joseph also didn't recognize the dreams for what they were, God communicating to him about his future. He should have spent his time trying to get closer to God, understanding the dreams and how God wanted Joseph to respond, rather than boasting to his brothers. Now, when we come to look at Joseph's brothers, you can understand why they might not have been Joseph's biggest fans. However, their failure was allowing themselves to become filled with violent hatred to the point of conspiring to murder their own brother. They clearly allowed their frustration and anger to fester and fester until it all blew up, instead of just talking to Joseph about it. Now, although Reuben acted to prevent this happening to Joseph, he was clearly too afraid or filled with hate himself to actually stand up to his brothers. Instead, he allowed them to sell Joseph off as a slave. Now, Judah stands out as he actually suggested making a profit from selling Joseph, that it would be more beneficial than merely killing him. He cared so little for his brother that he saw him as simply a means of gaining more wealth. They should have all recognized that Jacob's favoritism and Joseph's arrogance were sins against God, who would ultimately judge him himself. Better yet, when they saw how they were affected, they should have turned to God for help in dealing with Joseph and their anger. Instead, they betrayed their brother, conspired to kill him, then instead chose to sell him as a slave to gain a profit for themselves, then covered it up and lied to their father. Now, after this, Joseph ends up in Egypt and employed in a high position, and becomes very well thought of from one of Pharaoh's officials, Potiphar. We read how Potiphar's wife took a fancy to Joseph and repeatedly tries to have an affair with him. This is her first failing, as sex outside of marriage is a sin against God. It is also a betrayal to her husband. Her second failing was lying about it to get Joseph in trouble. She allowed herself to become angry that Joseph didn't want to sin and betray his employer. And then finally, we see the forgetfulness of the cupbearer. Being forgetful itself is certainly not a sin, but in this case the result was that Joseph spent more years in prison. The cupbearer was too focused on himself to remember Joseph. It suggests that once he was released from prison, he didn't really care what happened to Joseph. When reading a story like that of Joseph, it is important that we don't see this as simply a piece of fiction, but as both a story from history and God speaking to us. So why has God chosen to share these failings to us? Hopefully we'll never commit any of these particular sins, but it is a reminder to us that we fail God by sinning against him, and pretty frequently too. We may not be likely to commit some of these sins, but we can certainly learn how not dealing with your sin properly and timely can have great consequences. So right now, let's take a wee break and answer the following question. And leaders, you can pause the video, then resume when you're ready to continue. So the question is, how do we deal with our own failures? Okay, so sometimes we feel guilty for sinning, and often this guilt can lead us away from speaking with God. However, the Bible actually tells us to do the exact opposite. Hebrews 10:22 says this: "Let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with the full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled with Christ's blood." Now this is the important part, to cleanse us from a guilty conscience. So the first big question is, how can we move forward from failure? And the answer goes straight to God. This is absolutely vital. When we feel guilty, we lose some of our self-esteem or self-worth. Why would God love me when I keep failing him? Well, listen to this. In Ephesians 2:10, Paul tells us that we are his handiwork, created in Christ Jesus. The word handiwork is sometimes translated as masterpiece. We are his masterpiece, his greatest work. He absolutely loves you and cares for you, even when you fail. So you do not need to think less of yourself, but simply be reminded of how God thinks of you. Again, we read in Proverbs 3:5-6, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight." When he says in all your ways acknowledge him, the word acknowledge means to know intimately. God is inviting us to walk particularly closely with him in all circumstances, but especially when we struggle. However, it helps to already be walking closely with the Lord. I've found so often in my own life that I'll only turn to God when I need him for something. But we need to be walking with him constantly. If we rely on prayer and reading the word only when we struggle, then it'll be even more difficult to turn to God when we most need him. At the close of his letter to the church, Jude writes, "To him who is able to keep you from stumbling and to present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy." God is able to keep you from stumbling and to keep you on the right path. So we must make sure we are choosing to walk with him daily. In my cell last week, we all agreed that we would struggle if we were in Joseph's shoes. So what did he do to overcome his failures and those who failed him? He continued to be faithful to God and to walk in his footsteps. So now let's look at the story of the prodigal son. And in this story, we read of a man who thought he was too good for his family, who leaves his father, squanders all his inheritance, and ends up returning to his father to beg for forgiveness. However, in Luke 15:20, we read that while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. We don't even make it all the way back before the father comes running toward us. Now, something else to think about are the sins that we keep committing. Give it some thought and ask, why do I keep doing this? By actively thinking about specific sins, you are then able to better understand what drives you towards that sin, and also what pushes you into giving into temptation. Some of you will know that I have two cats called Albus and Remus. Guess what my wife and I are big fans of? Albus, well, he is a bit of a bully, and sometimes I look at him and I can see the cogs whirring in his head. So Remus will be all comfortable having a wee sleep, and Albus is staring at him. I can almost see a thought bubble. I want to sleep there. It doesn't take long before Albus gets up, storms across the room over to Remus, boops him, and then fights him for his seat. Poor Remus then has to find somewhere else to sleep. Now, Albus has multiple choices to make. He could choose to be content with where he is at, or he could ask Remus nicely if they could swap seats, or they could both share the same space, which they often do. However, there's a clear timeline of events that leads to the boop, and it really comes down to a selfish desire to have something his brother has and an unwillingness to share that. For us, we can look at the sins that we regularly commit and determine what happened to lead us to that sin. What choices did we have? What pushed us towards that sin? And what can we do to prevent it in the future? So back to the prodigal son, we also read that his brother was raging. He didn't think his brother deserved the forgiveness he received from his father. This can also be true of ourselves. People hurt us or others we love and we don't believe they deserve forgiveness. So this leads us on to the second big question then. How do we respond when others fail us? You need to remember two things. That you also fail, and remember how God deals with you when you fail. We must never be arrogant enough to think that someone else's failures are worse than our own. If God is able to forgive you, then you can certainly forgive those who fail you. Sometimes you need to take a step back and gain some perspective. And remember, what they have done to you is nothing compared with the amount of sin we commit against God. However, sometimes it is necessary to have an open and honest conversation with the person who failed you. And this is always better done when you're not angry and when you've had time to gather yourself together and really think about it. That way, you'll not go into it with all guns blazing, and therefore you'll be more likely to come to a resolution. And when you're struggling to forgive, most importantly, turn to the Lord, who is the King of forgiveness. No one knows better how to forgive those who do not deserve it. He will guide you towards forgiveness. And so, to close, what we don't see in this story is God abandoning anyone because they have sinned. Of course, we don't know what happened to Potiphar's wife or to the cupbearer, but we see that God was with Joseph throughout and even brought reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers. Timmy and Jordan will touch on this next week, but God was faithful to Joseph throughout his life and to his brothers who became the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. He didn't abandon any of them or give up when they sinned. He patiently and compassionately worked in their lives for their good. So when we put our faith in Jesus, we are forgiven for all our sins, past, present, and future. Of course, that does not a license to do whatever you want, but it is the assurance that no matter how and when we fail him, he is faithful to his promise to forgive us. He will stick with us no matter what we do or how frequently we do it. So why not stick by him and walk with him always?